Test 1, 2, 3. Test. Okay, welcome everyone. I want to share my screen just to remind you that you are here at a Historical Society of Greater Lansing event. We're doing a book discussion of the book Day of Days, a novel by John Smolens. And this is a picture of John. I'm going to have turn it over to Bill right now, and he's going to do some introductions.
Great.
So let me stop sharing my screen. Great, and I turn this over to Bill. Just a reminder to our audience members right now, we will have you muted. If you do have questions for our presenter, if you could type them into the chat feature. The chat is located along the bottom of your page, and it will pop up a box, and you'll be able to comment to the other presenters and staffers on the training. So I'm going to turn this over to Bill.
Thank you very much,
Bill?
Ann.
Okay, thanks.
And I really appreciate you being the headmaster here, because without you, this would not work. I'm president of the Historical Society, and we thought this book was of importance because of its clear relationship with the greater Lansing area and the interest in the Bath School bombing, which is ongoing, certainly. I would like to introduce Catherine. And I haven't seen Catherine probably in more than 9 months, but Catherine is the assistant director and the editor-in-chief of Michigan State University Press. And she is going to introduce John, but Michigan State University Press, as she'll tell you, is reissuing Mr. Smolens' books. John and I have known each other for quite a while now, and we've entered into a lot of unusual projects together, like the Jim Harrison exhibit that the Historical Society did at the library before COVID. And John was the guest speaker at that, and it was a very successful event. I'll thank him publicly for that here. Catherine, can you hear me?
I can. Thank you, Bill,
Okay.
and many
Thank
thanks
you.
to the Greater Lansing Historical Society for hosting this event. This is terrific. As Bill said, I'm Catherine Cox. I'm Assistant Director and Editor-in-Chief at Michigan State University Press, and it is my pleasure to introduce John Smolens to you this afternoon. John is the author of 10 novels and a collection of short stories, as well as many short stories and essays published in magazines. His work has been translated into Greek, Dutch, Italian, and Turkish. And as Bill said, Michigan State University Press is very proud to be his publisher. So John was also the 2010 Michigan Library Association's Author of the Year. And as probably many of you know, he has made the dramatic beauty and the severe climate of the Upper Peninsula, where he lives, into a character in some of his work, as in the perfectly titled Cold, which I made the mistake of reading my first winter here in Michigan. Frequently, he turns to historical events to explore their human agents and implications. And that's what he does in the book that he's here to talk about today, Day of Days. This novel examines the way that traumatic events, like the terrible bombing of the Bath School, scars survivors' lives long after the dead have been laid to rest and the physical wounds heal. And he also indicates that the resiliency of the people of Bath offers a much needed lesson to those of us living through horrors now, like mass shootings and COVID-19. And I don't think I need to say any more than that. John is here to tell you more in conversation with Matt Martin, co-founder of Optic Productions, who is making a documentary about the bombing as well. So thank you, everyone. Welcome. And Matt, over to you.
Thanks, Catherine. And thanks for joining us, John.
Thank you.
Just a little bit about your background. You were born and raised on the East Coast. Other than the obvious beauty of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, what drew you to the Midwest? You studied in Iowa before coming to Michigan?
I did, Matt. I had never set foot in Michigan until a year after I graduated from the University of Iowa. They have a graduate program commonly referred to as the Iowa Writers Workshop. It's an MFA program, Master of Fine Arts. I was hired here at Michigan State in 1985. And I was in a department called the Department of American Thought and Language. And many MSU students remember that it was a chilling experience or a very warm one, very seldom somewhere in between. And I taught in ATL, as it's often called, for 11 years, from 1985 to 1995. So without getting into the specifics of my exact age, for the second half of my life, I've been a Michigander and very glad to be here. But I did grow up on the East Coast. I was born in New York, raised in the Boston area, attended Boston College as an undergraduate, played hockey there for a little bit. Got a master's at University of New Hampshire. And then I went to Iowa, and I suddenly was surrounded by cornfields, pigs and cows and horses. And I said, this isn't so bad. And then I was offered a job here in Michigan, and I came and I actually stayed. My first apartment was probably about a 5-minute drive from where we are now.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Having read the story, it made me think of something you said in another interview when you mentioned, before I write it, I have to feel it. And that was something that struck me. It was probably in the first pages. They seem to be paced by the slow, steady clops of a horse as it carries this girl down a dirt road. Being a historical writer, can you share what helps you establish and anchor a reader in the sights and sounds of a time since long past?
Thank you. I like that question very much. First of all, as I've gotten old, I've always liked to read history, but as I've gotten older, I've been reading it more and more. My methods as a writer, I think, are really quite fundamental. I don't feel that I could really get into a story until I can somehow apply my senses to whatever I'm writing about. And I'm glad you mentioned the horse. The horse is named Daisy. And in a number of scenes, when these two children, Beatrice, commonly known as Bee, and her young friend Jed, who's about 2 years younger, they're often riding on the back of an old swayback horse, a mare named Daisy. And though I wasn't raised around horses, I think we all have, in most cases, we have very strong and I think fond feelings about the animal known as a horse. They have smells, they're a beautiful animal to look at. And we connect them with the land in many cases. And we connect them with certain environments. And, you know, certainly since I've been here in the Midwest, matter of fact, yesterday it was 40 miles west of Marquette, of Lansing, out in Ionia, visiting someone at a farm. And I'm looking out at horses and cows. So I think once I could somehow envision these two children riding on the back of this old horse named Daisy on a warm spring day, and think in terms of what it must have smelled like and sounded like, slowly that allowed me to get into the time period, which is nearly 100 years ago. There's so many things that have changed since then. Travel by foot and certainly on the back of farm animals, horses, cows, and so forth was very common still back then. And the automobile and the tractor and the combustion engine were these new alien forces that were just beginning to take over in our society. And in the first pages, that contrast or conflict, maybe you want to call it, is something I thought I really needed to introduce, that this was a period in our history when many folks, certainly people who lived in the countryside of Michigan, would have been caught between the two worlds, the world that they had known for so long, fields, cows, horses, and pigs, and these new elements that were arriving, increasingly so, the automobile and the truck and the tractor. So once I can, my senses can get attuned to those things, it seems that I can start to delve into the story and learn who the characters are. Can I ask a question before we start? I'm seeing that there's 38 participants, and it says that they're in the waiting room. Are they able to see us now? Do you know?
Yes, everybody's been admitted. Abby is coming in right now.
All right, okay. I just didn't want anybody waiting up,
39.
waiting.
No, there's a few of us monitoring that. Thank
All
you.
right, okay, thank you, thank you.
Excellent. For those unfamiliar with the story, just for context, I want to mention that when I talk about Bath, that's in reference to a village, a small town in Michigan. So John, when and how did you first hear of Bath?
Well, I can't, give you a specific date, but it certainly goes back to when I was living here in Lansing and teaching at MSU. And I don't remember the exact moment. Somehow I became aware of the fact that there was this small town, mere 10 miles or so northeast of Lansing, called Bath. And this terrible thing happened back in the 20s. A school was blown up, and I didn't know any of the circumstances. I just knew that had happened. And at that time, I wasn't thinking in terms of this is something that I want to write a book about. I just sort of tucked it away as being, another aspect of the history of Michigan. But it is the kind of thing that I think most of us who do write novels and stories and so forth, and make films, in your case, either consciously or in many cases subconsciously, you kind of file those things away for their potential. And at some point, and again, I can't be specific, but it was years ago, I started to think in terms of, this thing happened in Bath, and I'm sure that I was initially connecting it with the current news stories that unfortunately we've seen far too often in the last so many years of acts of violence against school children in schools, churches, public places, but particularly the schools. I'm sure were a catalyst for me to think back to, well, this happened almost 100 years ago in 1927. And at that point, I began to look into what were the particulars, who was the perpetrator, what might have been his motivation, and so forth. So I can't tell you exactly, but it was a long time ago. You realize that I went up to Northern Michigan University in 1995, which is now, I shudder to say, a quarter of a century ago.
Being no stranger to historical pieces, how did you research Day of Days?
Through a lot of reading. There's different kinds of when you say you read history, in the case of this particular book, this event, these specific events, there are not a great number of histories. I've written some of my other historical novels are set during the American Revolution, the assassination of President William McKinley in 1901, quarantines that took place in the 1790s on the New England coast. And there are multiple histories that I could draw from. The school bombing in Bath there hasn't been as much attention in terms of whole books, historical works being produced. There is one that I think is quite good, written by a professor. I think he's still at the University of Michigan. Arnie Bernstein wrote a book probably within the last 12 years or so, give or take, which gives really a very succinct but thorough overview of what he researched. He read just a remarkable amount of material, the daily newspapers and so forth. So I read that book. The notes in that are extensive. But then another source is, and this is often the case, people who were present in, at the time, who were somehow directly affected by the events, would write either something for a local newspaper or a magazine. There was one neighbor, Monty Ellsworth, who wrote, and I think he self-published a memoir about his recollections of what happened. I read that. And there's several books of that nature, which weren't written by professional historians who would give you more of the larger context surrounding the events, but would speak to how it affected them. And those are invaluable in their own way because it allows you to really almost step into the moment and moments when these things happen. What is interesting about all these different kinds of sources is how contrary or contradictory they can be. So the challenge as a fiction writer trying to base a story on history is that you're getting a number of different interpretations and descriptions of the same events, and they vary quite substantially. So I can what the story that I tell is not the definitive story. I don't believe that there is a definitive story, but I tried to wend my way through the different sources and provide a narrative that I think comes as close as possible to what probably happened. Let me just conclude this answer by reading one of the epigrams at the beginning of the book. There's he's passed away now, but there was a Eastern European, I believe he was Polish or Czech, journalist named Ryszard Kapuscinski, I think is how you pronounce it. And he wrote a book called Travels with Herodotus. And I was in Greece and Crete a little more than a year ago with my wife, and I've been reading quite a bit of Greek history and Herodotus since then. And there was a brief quote from that book that I put into this book because this is speaking to exactly what I'm talking about. He says, "The past does not exist. There are only infinite renderings of it." So I believe that that's a guiding principle for me, and I suspect for many people who try to write historical novels, basing a work of fiction on historical events that actually did occur.
Great. I also have a question here from the audience.
Yeah.
What were your observations about the contemporaneous newspaper coverage of the events?
Again, very contrary. Now, I didn't read every last. What was amazing about this bombing occurred in May of 1927. I believe it was May 18th. I'm pretty sure.
Right.
Which was the day before the school. This is a public school, kindergarten through 12. All right, which has a student population of 200, less than 300 students, I believe. This bombing was such an extraordinary event that within less than 24 hours, it was the major news story throughout the United States and into other countries. And it remained that way for 3 days. And I'll come back to those 3 days in a moment. Sad to say, much as we still see today in what we call the 24-hour media news cycle and all that, there's a great deal of contradictory information that is related, and in many cases, what we hear as being what is presented as news, we soon learn is grossly inaccurate. And many of the first news reports, of course, in those days, they were written in newspapers and they were broadcast on the radio. We had no television, no internet, none of that stuff. But much of what was originally written proved to be inaccurate once the authorities and so forth really started to sort out the details of what had happened. So I'm not suggesting that you take those initial news stories lightly, but in another way, they address the effect that such an event has on society. The language, if you read some of those newspaper articles, the language, it was not objective reporting. It was full of horror and outrage and shock, which reflected how people felt. Amazingly, also, 3 days after the bombing, for 3 days, the country is in a state of mourning and shock because this event occurred in small town Bath, Michigan. And 3 days later, Charles Lindbergh lands in Paris, and the entire world's attention turns in another direction. Someone had succeeded in flying across the Atlantic Ocean nonstop, landed in Paris. He was this great hero, and the news about Bath disappeared virtually overnight.
And as you mentioned, Day of Days is a work of fiction.
Mhm.
Yet the story is anchored on facts regarding the village of Bath and the horrific massacre that took place there, by and large adhering to the facts. Uh, Given the sensitivity of this subject, what was it like writing details such as the actions and dialogue of actual people that lived and died there at the time?
Well, now there's in this book and in my other historical novels, some characters are based on people who were there in Bath at the time. The main well, some of the main characters, like there's two children, B. Turcotte and Jedediah Brown, Jed Brown. They are truly, they're fictional. They're both students at the school, and using them, I use them in a way of sort of getting close to some of the truly historical figures. Now, the perpetrator of this heinous crime was a farmer named Andrew Keogh. He really existed. There are scenes in this book which are really, they derive, they're not taken from, but they derive, the impetus for writing them was because I found something in one of the historical accounts that said such and such happened. In some cases, there are lines of dialogue that were recorded in some history. Of course, I can't prove that they actually were said, because I think sometimes historians will add dialogue, to enhance the narrative as well. So in many cases, there are scenes that really do derive from the histories. But then, of course, there are many scenes, particularly the ones that involve Jed and B and some of the other children in the story, which are an attempt to try to show what life was like in Bath before this occurred, and certainly the day of the bombings. And since the story progresses for years, it really follows Jed and B through the rest of their lives, in an effort to show how their lives were changed and altered by this one event, which really gripped and made, or I should say, molded the way they viewed life for the rest of their days.
And along those lines, what do you feel is the role of survivor's guilt in the story? And did any of this tap into personal experience?
I'm sorry, did any of this tap into my personal experience?
Yes.
Well, there is a passage where, now I should maybe explain, I realize some folks certainly haven't read the book yet. The story is told from multiple points of view, but the main character is B. Turcotte, who is actually near the end of her life. She's very old. I don't give a specific age, but she's very old and she knows she's dying. And she's looking back on these events that occurred decades earlier. So the story moves back and forth. There are many scenes that take place in 1927, and then there are scenes, decades later where she's still sifting through the historical rubble, if you will, trying to sort out what it means to her. And at one point, because this is, when she's older, this is years after World War II, she links in many instances, there's been discussion in histories about World War II that the survivors of the concentration camps in Europe experienced what you might call guilt, survivor's guilt. And that was something that they really were forced to deal with for the rest of their lives. And she acknowledges that for her, and perhaps for some of the other people, the children who survived the Bath bombing, there is some element of guilt as well, in that they knew so many children who didn't survive, and unfortunately in some cases were seriously maimed and injured. So I hope that connecting those two elements, I don't think for me, it's not that much of a stretch. As far as my personal feelings about guilt, well, first of all, I was raised as a Catholic, so I've had my share. As a fiction writer, what is interesting for me is when you are writing from the point of view of characters who are very different from yourself. The main character here is a woman, an elderly woman, and also her perspective as a young girl. In some ways, it's difficult to get into that character and feel that you know her well enough to have her tell her story. But one of the things that I find really remarkable is that it also sort of frees up something within myself. I think I was able to write passages, write sentences, and express things that I don't know that I would have even arrived at if I were writing, say, autobiographically. But because I'm writing through the persona of this woman and this girl, these other elements came out. So if I have experienced guilt in my life, and I believe we all do, somehow I'm able to channel it through what she was experiencing herself, and just hope that the two mesh and become convincing for the reader.
And as you say, the story demonstrates the effect of this strategy into the furthest stages of B's life. As if a wound, it's really not healed by time. Do you think in regard to this massacre that could apply to the village of Bath and perhaps even larger society?
Well, I can't, I can't say that, I can't speak for Bath as its own collective society. I do think, I hope that anyone who reads this book, the story it has three fundamental sections. There's the initial section, which is before the bombing. Then the middle section portrays the day of the bombing, which many things happened within a short period of time. There was great chaos and confusion. Nobody understood what was happening for a good while. And then the latter portion of the book is the aftermath. To the best of my ability, I tried to portray the town of Bath and what I think it must have been like leading up to the events of that day in May 1927. As far as in the aftermath, I tried to portray the different, very strong emotions people felt. That naturally there was shock, there was horror, there was anger, sadness of such depth that I don't know that I could ever express it other than trying to show how people acted in many cases. There's one moment when one of the a local sheriff and the prosecuting attorney for the county at the time, who are real figures historically, they're characters in the story, and they're talking about the situation where the parents are coming to the town hall to identify bodies, children's bodies, and how some of the parents are expressing emotions, but how often some of the parents would look at their dead child and there would be no apparent, no visible sign of emotion. They would simply say, yes, this one is ours. And it was clearly understood by these two men that it wasn't for a lack of emotion that that's the way they appeared, but the emotion was so great that it's almost like I think that they would have been, they're frozen. They're unable to express it or demonstrate it at that point in time. Certainly, there are other scenes where people would show considerable emotion. There's one scene later on when a woman leaves the house in the middle of the night, and since she simply walks out into the fields and disappears into the dark, almost like she's seeking the anonymity of the dark night to try to hide within her grief.
And talking about the two main characters, would it be accurate to say how they begin the story as children or adolescents? Might this be considered a coming of age story? I
would hope so. I would hope so. At the time of the bombing in 1927, there are 4 children. Two are the primary characters in that the story is told through their points of view. B. Turcotte is 14 and Jed Brown is 12. And then there's B's slightly older sister, Alma, who's 15 going on 16. And there's a boy who's a little bit older still, named Warren. So, and yes, I wanted to portray them. I don't believe in typical people. I don't believe in normal people, really. But I did have scenes, particularly before the bombing, where they are interacting in ways that I think are consistent with the way most young adolescents interact. There are jealousies, there are feelings of affection, they feel guilt, they think they're trying to get away with something half the time. They're always fearful of some kind of parental guidance is suddenly going to descend upon them. So yes, there is certainly a coming of age element, which in this story is, I think, really quite dramatically altered by the events of the day of the bombing. And then in the latter portion of the story, how particularly these two young people, B and Jed, attempt to cope with that is where the story goes. As far as the town of Bath, I hope that in overall is portrayed as a town that showed remarkable resilience in many ways. People carry on in the face of such a grim circumstance. Even though they're grieving, they did their chores. Children went back to school, people went to work. Things had to be done. And in many cases, I suspect for people who experienced that, there was solace in that. The fact that they could go back to the normal aspects of daily living. It was the only thing that they could think to do.
How did this differ from other works that you've done?
Well, I would hope that anyone who took the time to read all of my books would see that they are very different. I think that this isn't the first time that I've written about adolescence, since we're talking about that particular period of life. Some of my other stories have dealt with teenagers and people in their early 20s. But the focus in this story is really quite substantially on that period, the stages of adolescence and the uncertainty and what we go through on a daily basis. You're not a fully formed individual in many cases. In some of my other stories, I think the characters they're a little further along in their development. I would say that's one of the differences. Some of the other novels, I probably have more truly historical figures. For example, I have a book called The Schoolmaster's Daughter, which is set in 1775, the spring that the American Revolution broke out in Boston. I grew up in Boston, or right outside of Boston. It's based on a family that actually did live in Boston at the time. It was a schoolmaster named John Lovell. And the story is based on he and his wife, who were ardent Tories, loyal to the British Crown, and their children were patriots. And they operated, and they really did do this. They operated as spies working for the patriot cause. So this story, I think there's actually more of a fictional element in the story about Bath. The events are based on historical record, but the portrayal of these characters, it is truly fictional.
And this might be tangential, so I apologize in advance to our audience members.
I love tangents, it's okay.
Can you share some insight on, from the perspective of our little girl in the village, the freedom of birds and hobos?
Oh, yes. There's one of I hate to use some of these terms from English class, but I guess you could say there's sort of a subplot In my reading about this period, the 1920s, this isn't specific to Bath. Throughout the country, there was a society of people, mostly men, but certainly many women as well, who we now refer to them often as hobos, who now we say homeless, but they didn't have homes. For whatever reason, they left home, and they often rode the rails, as as we would say. That was the mode of transportation that was most available. And small towns like Bath, it was very common for hobos to come through and inhabit remote places, particularly in the woods. They could hide out in the woods. And so the relationship between these children who are being raised in the incubator, if you will, of their hometown, they come into some contact with a few hobos. There's one in particular that is involved in the story, and I'm not going to go into that in great detail. And in some ways, this is what novelists like to do in many cases, is you try to hold up different facets of society and have them face each other so that their differences reflect off of each other. And these homeless wanderers, when they come into contact with these children who know nothing but their hometown, and have their meals provided for them, they have chores and they go to school and they have friends and so forth. For me, there's a dynamic there that I really wanted to explore. I think maybe I'm going off on a tangent here. Stop me if I go too far. There's a romanticism that has built up around hobos, and I wouldn't want to portray the hobos in this story as purely romantic, but I also do believe, based on histories that I've read about them, is that in many cases, there was what they called, the hobos operated according to a code of honor, their own code of honor. And this has been well documented. So although they were feared, and parents would often warn children, don't go near the hobos and so forth. In fact, in many instances, these men and women who were wandering through the countryside behaved in ways that demonstrated that they operated according to the rules of their own society. And this becomes part of the story. And again, I hope that this plays off the fact that, at the very center of the story, we have a farmer in the town who breaks all the rules, who for various reasons decides he wants to destroy everything. And there's one hobo in particular, without giving away too much, that I think really acts very honorably. I hesitate to say heroically, but he does some things that a lot of people would not have given a hobo credit for doing. Is that too much of a tangent? I hope not.
No, that's great. Thanks. It's referenced a couple different times, and I know this literally applied because of what Eastern Standard Time was a newfangled thing.
Yes.
Was adhering, and in the inquest, there's as to the actual time of the explosion is referenced in two different ways because of railroad time or whatever we want to call it. Can you just illuminate, and this is my final question, how bath time contrasts with the outside world?
Well, this is for me, one of the real pleasures of writing historical fiction. When I'm reading history, the stories just jump out at you. The things that humans have done throughout history, it's incredible. And very often when I'm reading a history, a scene it's dying to be told. And there are also details that really, I hope, I can use to give real credibility to the story I'm telling. At the very beginning of our discussion, I mentioned Daisy, the horse. Every time Daisy was on the page, I almost felt secure. I felt like, as long as I've got Daisy near me, I'm okay. I wasn't raised on farmland. okay? But Daisy made me feel like, I'm a little bit closer. The business about time, it may seem hard to believe now, but the United States government did not develop a uniform method of telling time according to different time zones across the continental United States until, I don't know the exact date, but around the early 1920s. And it was still just like the automobile and the combustion engine, and just like electric lights. This is also the year that electricity was wires were being sent from the power plant here in Lansing. They were just then being erected on poles and sent out to Bath. So Bath was moving from having kerosene lanterns and so forth to having electric lights in their houses. Time was also something that was going through this great transition. And although the US government had established that there would be specific time zones, it was still such a new concept that certain communities resisted conforming to what was being dictated by larger forces outside. And Bath was one of these communities, not the only one. So as I recall, for just a few years, a handful of years, the state of Michigan primarily was placed in the Eastern time zone as we are today. Whereas previously it had been more of this in the Central time zone. Bath, for whatever reason, said, we're not going along with that. We're sticking with Central time zone. So when you went into Bath, you were automatically, there was an hour difference. And again, without going into all the details, the day of the bombing, one of the reasons that I think you can say that Andrew Keogh probably was experiencing some confusion, and probably he was nervous, even though he didn't really reveal it to the people around him, was that he got time confused. And his watch, he kept referring to his watch, and he had timers on the bomb, the timing device to set off the school, and also at his farm, because he blew his farm up as well. And he confused the times. So, a little detail like that, I hope really makes what life in Bath must have been like then. I think just that element gave Bath a sense of its own identity. It was separate from the towns around it because, hey, we're on Bath time. We're our own people. When you come into town, you're on our time. We're not on your time, which I think says something about the character of the place.
Great. Yeah, I almost felt like in some ways, it was funny that you answered that that you started your answer the way that you did, because I felt in some ways that the slow footsteps of Daisy the horse were in some ways also Bath time, and the pace of their community was not the fast paced, of course, which,
right,
as you say, took over all of American society. Well, I can see that some of our audience has questions as well, so I'd be happy to pass it over to them. Thanks, John.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Matt. Pleasure, really.
Pleasure.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to read a comment from Cindy. And this kind of dovetails on the last question that was asked. The bombing undoubtedly and inevitably affected the emotional health of the Bath community. Do you think that it also impacted the potential growth of Bath? Did it stunt that growth?
I certainly hope that it created a sense of growth. I suspect that there were a great number of people particularly people who were, members of families that were directly affected. Like the characters, the fictional characters in my story, I suspect that life never was the same, and there are many things that were remarkably difficult going years and years after the events themselves. I take a fair amount of time in the beginning of the third part of the story in describing the immediate days after the bombing. Again, the details that come out, I try to use details taken from histories. How did the town of Bath deal with, burials with funeral services and so forth. I mean, there were a number of days where there would be many in one day. How were the burials of Andrew Keogh dealt with? Okay, I won't go into that, but it's based on what they actually did. That was a real problem. Exactly, how do you bury a man under those circumstances? His wife, whom he killed, either before the bombing of the farmhouse or after, I don't think they've ever determined that with certainty. How, her burial was a whole different circumstance. I think it's safe to say it was a most difficult transition for the people of Bath to go from experiencing this back to some sense of a daily routine, normal life. Quite frankly, I think it's courageous that they did as well as they did. I can only speculate on what it really meant to people who experienced this, but this is what novelists try to do. I tried to give the sense in the latter stages of the book that from such horrific incidents, people can and will draw strength. They'll find the strength in sharing their grief with others, in coming to understand that they're not alone. That being said, the two main characters, Jed and Bee, have great difficulties. The boy Jed, he becomes very belligerent. He gets into a lot of fights. He drinks. He runs into a lot of trouble because he just doesn't know how to handle this sort of thing. But as the story progresses, without giving it all away, I think as he matures and as he and Bee, their lives go apart and then they reunite some years later, what happened to them makes them who they are. And to the best of their ability, I think that they accept that they will always be scarred by this. And once you're scarred, you cannot eliminate scars. It's something that doesn't necessarily heal and go away. To the best of your ability, you'll learn to live with it. So I hope that there's some resurgence of strength as the story moves toward its conclusion.
Thank you. John, we did have a question that was emailed to me, so I'm not sure if they're on the call or not.
Okay.
And just a recap, not having read the book, can you tell us about the bomber's motive? Do you want to give a brief snapshot into Kehoe's motive?
Well, here again, this is purely the speculation of somebody writing fiction. And I don't think there was one motive, let me put it that way. Many of the historical accounts I've read take note of certain things, and I try to work them in. As a novelist, you describe what people do, what they say, and there are scenes where I get into the thought processes of the man's mind. But it is purely speculative. One thing that it seems all the historical material that I read references is that going back to when he was very young, Andrew Keogh was vehemently opposed to taxes. He inherited this from his father. His father, he grew up down in Tecumseh, down south of Ann Arbor. And his father was vehemently opposed to taxes as well. So by the time he's a grown man and living in Bath, living on a farm that belonged to his wife's family. When the school that was blown up was built 5 years in 1922, 5 years before the bombing. So it was a new thing. And this is another thing that was occurring in towns like Bath all over the country. Prior to this, you still had one-room schoolhouses. Public education was a very, very different process. Bath made a serious decision at the beginning of the 1920s. They said, we're going to build this one, it was called the Bath Consolidated School. It was a beautiful building for its time. And they were going to build this building and put all the school children, K through 12, in there. Okay. And this was the future of the town. And 5 years later, it's blown up. One of the primary reasons was because they built the school building, which amazingly, I don't think it cost much more than about $40,000. I can't remember the exact figure, but an incredibly small amount by today's standards, but by their standards, this resulted in taxes for all the residents of Bath were raised. And he was vehemently opposed to this. Now, there are other elements I won't develop. I think a lot of it had to do with his marriage. It was a childless marriage. He and his wife, Nellie, who was much loved by her neighbors and people in Bath. She was a native of Bath. They married relatively late, and for whatever reason, they did not have children of their own. I would say those two elements, along with some other things that I work in, I think probably contributed to his getting to the point where he was capable of committing such an act, which was not a spur of the moment crime of passion. This had to have taken place over the course of weeks, more likely months, to plan and develop, to acquire the material and then get it into the school and run the wires and everything. This was he was a very methodical person, which also contributed to the way he behaved. He had a real sense of method about him, very organized.
Thank you. Before I forget, John, the book Day of Days, where can people purchase it, or how are they? I put a link down to your website in the chat.
Day of Days is published by Michigan State University Press. At the very beginning of the program, Catherine Cox, our editor, my editor, they're wonderful to work with, I have to tell you. They have been reissuing my earlier books, which were published by a number of different publishers in places like New York. You've heard of New York. I remember New York.
They are on your website.
Publishing my new work.
Perfect. Thank you, Catherine.
To go directly to Michigan State University Press, you can get copies. The usual outlets like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, it's available there. I will put in a little plug. Where I live up north in Marquette, there's a wonderful bookstore, Snowbound Books. It's 5 minutes from my house. And very often people will contact them and request a signed copy. And my friends at Snowbound will call and I'll come down and sign. And I'll sign it to Uncle Joe, happy birthday and Merry Christmas and so forth. And I'm always glad to do that. So I think it's available. It's very easy to acquire.
Great. Catherine has added some links and some local bookstores in the chat. I have a comment from Dick and Colleen, and I'm sorry, I'm probably going to mess up your last name, Zameen, thank you.
Yes.
Friends of yours. And it says, it sounds like you've been working on this novel for some time. Since you've been such a prolific writer, how do you assign priorities to what comes next, assuming you work on more than one novel at a time? Specifically, why not finish this novel before some of the others?
Well, that sounds like a Dick and Colleen question. Now, in full disclosure, we are related by marriage. I've known Dick and Colleen for a long time. And the answer is, Dick and Colleen, I don't really know. I get up in the morning and I'm usually anxious. This is a good thing. I can't wait to get to the desk and sit down and start working. This little mechanism begins whirring, and I drink a lot of tea when I write. I don't write one book at a time. I can't tell you. I'd have to go back and look at my computer and check the dates on various drafts. I'm sure that I've been working on this book for a minimum of 5, maybe 6 years. Now, that doesn't mean I've been working on it exclusively all that time. I'll work on a book for several years. And then it's sort of just, I run out of gas. I don't know where to go with it. I'm tired of it. It's tired of me. And I'll put it aside. And then hopefully something else will come up. And I'll work on that, often for an extended period of time. I'm a strong believer in the subconscious doing work. And when I'm not directly involved in a manuscript, I think that the subconscious whirring is going on, so that a year or more later, when I go back and begin to work on something. When I read something, a manuscript that I haven't actually looked at in say over a year, it's like someone else wrote it. And that can be good and that can be bad. I will immediately see problems that I have to resolve. I'll see what is working in some cases. In many cases, I'll see that I really don't need that, or this is something that needs to be dramatically changed. In all honesty, I don't have a tried and true method. I tend to leapfrog one manuscript over the other. And since Dick, you're such a sports fan, Dick actually was a great ball player for MSU many years ago. He and his twin brother were ball players at MSU. I'll end with a baseball metaphor. I think of it as my bullpen method. When the arm of one manuscript gets tired, I go to the bullpen and I'll take another manuscript out of a file in the computer. And so I hope I'm always working on something that I feel is rather alive and is moving forward of its own momentum. And it's just sort of, I'm being carried along by it. Nice to hear from you, Dick and Colleen.
We have one more question before we wrap up,
Okay.
and I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Valeria from Italy has a question for you, John.
Ciao, Bella.
Do you think you will maybe write a story dealing with this COVID period sometimes in the future, or perhaps you are doing that now?
Okay, well, Valeria Aluccio lives in Trento. We would say Trent, but they live in a beautiful village village above a city called Trento, in the mountains, Dolomites, in the northeastern portion of Italy. And she and Alberto, her husband, and their children, Gaia and Matteo, I call them my Italian family. I've stayed with them many times. I've known them for many years. It's wonderful to hear from you. The answer is non lo so. I don't know. If I do, I'm going to have to live a lot longer. I think we all need time to process what we're going through now. I'm one I know some writers really like to write about something that is happening right at the moment. That immediacy feeds their imagination. I'm on the other side of that. I need to have time to let things sort of gestate. And maybe this is one of the reasons why I'm drawn more and more to historical material. But there may be a time down the road when I would write about COVID. One of my earlier novels was about a similar situation. A novel I wrote, which was re-released by Michigan State University Press last year, was called Quarantine. And in the 1790s, there was more than one instance on the coast of Massachusetts, in an old seaport where I used to live, called Newburyport, Massachusetts, about 30 miles north of Boston. These trading ships, tall ships, would come into the harbor with crews that were sick and dying from what then were mysterious fevers, yellow fever, scarlet fever, whatever you want to call it. And they didn't have any medical knowledge to really deal with this. So the only thing they knew to do was to quarantine the sick from the healthy. And that novel is a portrait of what I presume happened in the harbor town of Newburyport, when suddenly this epidemic sweeps through the town and people are dying horribly, really, in some cases within a matter of hours. It was sort of a small version of the Black Plague. Whether I'll write about the COVID situation, I don't know. I'm sure there will be many writers and artists who will address it at some point. And I might say that, Matt, I'm really looking forward to the documentary that you and Optic, I understand, are putting together. I believe it would be very instructive for Americans and people beyond to understand what happened there, and to see that there are, the connections between the past and the present. It's dangerous to sever them, to think that's so far in the past it doesn't matter. I think we need to keep looking back if we're able to understand the present and and have some sense of what the future may hold.
Yes, and as you said, even the facts of this are often eyewitness and often vary so much.
Yeah.
In the case of our documentary, we've been working on it for 15 years. I just realized in the last months that this is really oral tradition. We have,
Yes.
and you can speak with the descendants now, and the echo is loud. And yeah, I agree. I think it's a disservice to negate the fact or forget the fact that America's worst school massacre happened nearly 100 years ago, and it is very relevant today.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you, John and Matt, and also Catherine. I'm going to turn this over to Bill for some final closing statements. I just want to thank you again for your time today.
Okay, before Bill speaks, can I just say, I'm seeing there's now 37 participants. I want to thank you all. In the past, when I've been fortunate to have a book come out, I've truly enjoyed traveling around the state and the country to bookstores, libraries, and schools, and obviously that is not possible now. I certainly hope that we can get back to that sense of normalcy in the very near future. I miss the immediate contact, but I greatly appreciate Anne and Bill and Matt, and having all of you join us. This means a lot to me. Writing novels is a very solitary endeavor, and being able to talk with people about what you've written, it's wonderful compensation. So thank you very much, all. Really.
John, I'd like to thank you too. You do a fantastic job in this format, and not everyone does, me included. What I wanted to do is just give a little shout out to a very low key but very moving memorial and museum in Bath, Michigan. If you're in the Lansing area, take a short side trip to Bath. There they have the cupola from the school on exhibit outside, and also a historical marker from the state of Michigan. At some point after COVID, you'd be able to go into the middle school across the street, where they have assembled a small archival museum, which is very moving, and I really recommend that people go visit it when they can. Also, I'd like to remind people that we will be putting this recording on the Historical Society of Greater Lansing's website, so people can download it and watch it at any time. And we will be keeping people up to date on the documentary that Optic is doing. So when the release is available and things like that, you'll be able to find it certainly on the Historical Society of Greater Lansing website, which we encourage everyone to join if you're interested in history, and especially local Lansing history. And that's lansinghistory.org is our website, but just visit Facebook at Historical Society of Greater Lansing and join. We have more than 10,000 members, which is a remarkable number of people for a local history site. And it's one of our main sources of getting information out. Just this last week, I posted a photograph of a Lansing site that I knew was Lansing, but not where exactly. And did I not recognize that the photo had been reversed? It would have been a lot easier to identify, but pretty much like 60 people tuned in to help identify that exact location. And it helps because that photograph is going to be in an exhibit at the Broad Museum, which is coming up. And we didn't want to get it wrong. And our best resources are the people of Lansing. They're just beautiful at doing this. So thank you everyone for joining us. And this will be the first of many Zooms we'll be doing in the next probably a year. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Grazie.
Thank you, John. Nice job.
Thanks, John.
Hi, guys.
Good
How you doing?
program. Good stuff.
Great to see you.
Hi, John.
Thanks, John.
Dina, hello. Hello.
Hello.
Oh, I'm seeing all sorts of, this is like Hollywood Square.